find out today, and someone who lives very near me has criticized me for reading too much and not speaking. I don't know who that lady would be. But guess what? You're going to get a lot of reading. This is a longer final chapter.
See how much I influence?
And that's right, that's how much I listen. Sabbath and the Ten Commandments. But he's got this chapter just loaded. And there's some things that you just got to hear from out of Walter Brueggemann's mouth, not out of my mouth. I mean, I'll talk. You know that. You know me enough to know I'm going to talk. But particularly the opening prayer and then that closing page or page and a half that he does several times the way I've read that to you, you're going to find out. But so I apologize on the front end, but I don't. Let's open with prayer. God of the ages, our present age is shaped by our incessant drive to have more stuff. The gods of commerce and power seduce us into believing we are defined by the quantity of our possessions, not by the quality of our relationships. Quiet our endless, restless search for stuff. Bring us into the quiet center wherein you and your spirit call is clear. In the name of Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Brueggemann, throughout this whole final chapter, will describe to us recurring practices of the ancient world first. Now, I'm going to shorten that kind of area by pitting agrarian peasants against urban elites. Now, that said that was the ancient world. Does it sound like today? It may not be agrarian, but same thing. An inherently uneven and coercive contest. See who wins. Also gives us 5 instances in his teaching of the early church that illustrate the importance of the implementation of the Ten Commandments. On your own, that's okay. We in a group. It's just all in a group. Sorry. Shows I don't need to read quite as much. We can say, what can we say about the significance of each of the following contrasts? Thanksgiving against, here's that big word. It goes in big words. Acquiescentiveness.
Yes.
That's pretty close, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it's acquiring lots and lots of, the acquiring side. The old self against the new self, the craving against the gift. In the culmination of the study, Brueggemann returns to the assertion that in the commandment on the Sabbath, commandments 1 and 10, I think that's really interesting the way he pulls up together commandments. First commandment, the last commandment, come together. Both idolatry and greed are rejected because they reduce living to a commodity. So we see and hold on to, mainly holding on to. What does it mean when he suggests that Sabbath is a big no to idolatry and greed, but also more than that? And why is Sabbath a school for our desires? Take time to be human. He's quoting from Take Time to Be Holy and then addressing that from the hymn. He suggests that perhaps it would be better read, take time to be human, take even better, or even better, just take time. Finally, he observes that the Sabbath is taking time, time to be holy and time to be human. We get now into that. That's sort of from the summary of the chapter. So I wanted you to hear that first, and then we'll follow after that. And again, I apologize for the reading, but here it comes. Well, if I get the right chapter rather than the notes. I mentioned the first and the last, but he starts this off talking about the fourth commandment of the Sabbath compels rest for all members of the household, all members of the community, human and animals, slaves, servants, all. At that point, this is coming from Exodus, so he's talking very much about the ancient world, the world we see described early in our Bibles. The fourth commandment anticipates a peaceable household and neighborhood and sets out a discipline and limit that will serve that peaceableness. The six commandments that then follow, remember he talked about how it was first 4 and then the last 6 in the description there. The 6 commandments that follow on neighborliness reach a climactic point in the 10th commandment on coveting, that is presented perhaps as an act of ultimate destruction of the neighborhoodness. For coveting generates mistrust, sets neighbor against neighbor. The 10th commandment has very often been distinguished from the preceding commandments by suggesting that unlike the others, it contains only an intent or an attitude and not an act, thus unlikely forcible against actions of killing, committing adultery, or stealing. For that, it's almost surely a mistaken interpretation of that commandment, says Brigham. Coveting is understood in biblical tradition as including both an attitude of craving and a forcible action to secure what is craved. Always grasping, always reaching in, always wanting more. Thus, the commandment concerns a posture and practice of acquisitiveness, wanting to acquire. The capacity and readiness to acquire what properly belongs to another, so to place the well-being of the other in jeopardy. These are strong words he's putting on us, isn't it? As he interprets what we sometimes read, oh, I got the 10 Commandments, I'm reciting. But he's telling it like it is. Tell it like it is, brother. Tell it like it is. You know, that kind of thing. The specifics of such community-destroying greed include house and wife. House refers to the entire socio-economic aggregate of a village household. In a patriarchal society, moreover, the wife may be reckoned as the principal property. A house refers to the entire socio-economic aggregate of the village household. The male head of the household, all of these things are to cover that. Beyond house and wife, the prohibition concerns the householder's means of production, that is, economic viability, slave, ox, donkey, etc. It's prohibited to infringe economically on the well-being of others. The commandment ends with a conclusion so sweeping that nothing is exempt from the rule of everything that belongs to your neighbor. The term neighbor occurs, what strikes one about this list is that the very brief statement on prohibition, the term neighbor occurs 3 times. It is all about respecting the neighbor, and so it is all about preserving, honoring, and enhancing the neighborhood, not coveting it. It is most probable that the neighborhood in purview was an agrarian village, we talked about that, of vulnerable peasants, each of whom lived a vulnerable economic existence with no margin for loss. Thus, Sabbath rest in context means to protect the space and the property of the neighbor from the restlessness that disrupts and skews social relationships by stopping the acquisitive practices. He didn't put quite as many syllables in that one, did he? Most particularly in the tradition of Deuteronomy is concerned with neighbors, and especially the most vulnerable neighbors, widows, orphans, and immigrants. The commandment seems to be a quite particular rule concerning the love of neighbor, when Jesus subsequently identified as the second great commandment in Mark 12. The neighbor is to be loved as self, and property of the neighbor, his house, his wife, means of production, are to be protected even as one who owns one's own home, wife, and means of production. So he's talking about what we really do to try to honor that. He then goes on, and I'm not going to try to read lots of this, continue to talk about the agrarian and so forth, but he does, it is most likely that the law of release in Deuteronomy reflects the reality of such unequal social power. The sharp warning issued by Moses that the creditors should not be hard-hearted, tight-fisted, indicates the ideological resistance to such a requirement or limitation. The royal enterprise, by contrast, is fully emancipated by such an ancestral notion. This is coming from 1 Kings. He's talking about Naboth. And what we remember, again, we can go into that. That's, Queen Jezebel. That's part of Naboth. The relationship of person and land is close and beyond question. The royal enterprise, by contrast, is fully emancipated from such ancestral notions of property and views, and all property as a tradable commodity. Ahab and Jezebel are an embodiment of the acquisitive worldview before which traditional claims are weak and malleable. Also goes in, talks in Malachi, in the 2nd chapter. It's given us lots of Bible references here to set his point and bring it to conclusion. Time slots, night and day, bespeak of the power of desire and the pattern to secure. Secure what one desires. So again, he keeps talking about all these giving all these Old Testament references about the idea of the consuming side and forgetting the neighborly side. The introduction of the Lord of Hosts in verse 9, and this is excuse me. What? No, that's Isaiah. Okay. In verse 9, it indicates that such a economic transaction does not go unnoticed. The inescapable outcome of such land dealing, the respect of Yahweh, is that such extravagances are unsustainable. In ways beyond explanation, the poetry declares a great reversal to come on what is both unsustainable and unacceptable, so that many large and beautiful houses will be destroyed or abandoned. Worse than that, the agricultural land that is no longer cared for by an attentive peasants will simply fail to produce. One might imagine that such a prospect about loss of productivity constitutes an early warning concerning the agribusiness that will eventually ruin the land by neglect. Now let's talk a little more about that 10th commandment. Well, there's some on Deuteronomy here where he sort of paraphrases and then talks about that. Deuteronomy and then a couple of references from Proverbs. You must not move your neighbor's boundary marker. Don't take up that iron stake that marks your property and stretch it over and assume and then start farming on it real quickly and say, oh, well, I've been on that land all along, that's mine. Set up by former generations on the property that will be allotted to you in the land of the Lord your God is given you to possess. Do not remove the ancient landmark that your ancestors set up. Do not remove the ancient landmark or encroach on the fields of orphans, for their Redeemer is strong. He will plead their case against you. That's all from Deuteronomy and a couple of references from Proverbs. We talked about the 10th commandment. It's a safeguard for a certain way of organizing social power in the interest of the neighborhood. Such neighborliness is eroded and eventually destroyed when the unchecked acquiring of the powerful praise of the vulnerable. Then he talks some out of Jeremiah, practices transgressing borders and so forth. Told you it was going to be a push here to get through this, and I think we'll do it. The phrase greedy for unjust gains, that's does not employ the words of the 10th commandment, but the intent, says Brigham, is the same. All have become predators and coveters. All have skewed social relationships in dealing falsely with people. In order to make such acquisition economy work, it is necessary to disguise the true economy with the euphemism of well-being that contradicts the facts on the ground. They have treated the wound of my people carelessly, saying peace, peace, when there is no peace. The wound of the body politic, all of us, is acute. Later on in chapter 30:12, the theology of exceptionalism in Jerusalem, a city named for Shalom, will override all such social suffering. Thus, under the banner of ideology, the practices are very exploitive into this type of economy go unchecked. They remain unchecked, says the poet, except for the divine therefore in verse 15. They act shamefully. They committed abomination, yet they were not ashamed. They did not know how to blush. Therefore, and then he goes on with some therefores. Now in Luke, the 10th commandment, of course, runs in Christian tradition towards the teaching of Jesus. In the parable of Luke 12:13-34, Jesus summarizes the two ways that are as old as a covenant and as poignant as the Naboth narrative we ran by a minute ago. In response to the man in dispute with his brother over family inheritance, Jesus provides a pivot point. The list taken in sum amounts to the old self. The writer knows that the cluster of practice always comes together. They are rooted in a sense of self, immune to the truth of neighborliness. You have stripped off the old self with its practices, have clothed yourself with the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge according to the image of your Creator. The new self is situated in the midst of neighbors, of new conduct is granted in neighbor regard. As God's chosen one, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another, and if anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other. That's just easy, isn't it? No one will fail to notice that the term forgive occurs twice in that small quote. Perhaps the pivot point of a new life. Such forgiveness includes the forgiveness of debts. You remember the Hebrew system set up both at a 7-year and a 49th or 50th year, times where you had acquired things, particularly at the Jubilee, the 50th, everything went back. So in effect, for 50 years you might have squatters' rights to it, you may have taken it, but at the end of the 50th it was very hard on you if you did not follow that. And of course on the, again, that's 7, and I guess 7 times 7 is the 49. You have stripped off the old self with this practice and has clothed yourself new. The Lord's chosen one, holy and beloved, clothe yourself with the compassion, kindness. We talked about that. One will not fail to notice the term forgive occurs twice, which we just mentioned. Those, James reflects on these disputes within the church grounded in cravings. James says, those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Do they not come from your craving? They're at war within you. You want something and you do not have it, so you commit murder. And you covet something and cannot obtain it, so you engage in disputes and conflicts. You do not have it because you did not ask. Cravings create conflicts, dispute in the neighborhood. The accent of asking in verse 2 suggests an alternative to craving, and that is a transaction of gift, the asking and receiving. So where we're playing the game of keeping up with the Joneses, if they've got it, I want it, and I wish I had what they had, kind of attitude, instead shifts, begins to shift. The rhetoric of adultery and insatiability entice suggests a notion that all of life is an object of conquest and exploration. To be trained in greed means to reduce all of life to a tradable commodity. He doesn't leave much unsaid in this, does he? The accumulated testimony from the earliest church leaves for us a task of drawing an obvious conclusion. Ours, like that of an ancient society of Israel, is like the context of the early church, offers a social script for a social system of coveting. That big word. Indeed. Our consumer society is grounded in a generation of artificial desires, readily transposed into urgent needs. So we got this desire, and ultimately becomes an urgent need. The always emerging new desires and new needs create a restless striving that sets neighbor against neighbor in order to get ahead, to take advantage, to accumulate at the expense of all. The power of such compulsion to get, of course, negates neighborly positivism. Sabbath is variously restraint, withdrawal, divestment from the concrete practice of society that specializes in anxiety. Sabbath is an antidote to anxiety that both derives from our craving and in turn feeds our craving more. Sabbath is an arena in which to recognize that we live by gift and not by possession. That we are satisfied by relationships of attentive fidelity and not to amassing commodity. We know in the gospel tradition that we may indeed gain the whole world but lose ourselves, from Mark 8. Thus, Sabbath is a soul receiving when we're in the posture of receptivity before our Father who knows what we need. Luke 12. In the end of our reflections, we can consider the way in which Sabbath commandment occupies the pivotal space in the sum of all the commandments. At the outset, we discern that the Sabbath commandment looks back to the emancipating God of the Exodus, who delivers from the restless productivity of Pharaoh and who rests on the seventh day. We observe that the Sabbath commandment looks forward to a possible neighborliness in which striving for commodity in community-destroying ways is prohibited. Thus, the fourth commandment reaches back to commandment 1 and forward to commandment 10. The two commands 1 and 10 then come together in startling interpretation, no doubt in the wake of rabbinic awareness. And he puts the term emphasis added in parentheses to that. Be sure of this, that no fornicator or impure person or one who is greedy, that is, an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Ephesians 5. Put to death, therefore, whatever in you is earthly fornication, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which is idolatry. Colossians 3:5. Almost incidentally and without attention to this, these testimonies identify idolatry that is rejected in the commandment 1, and greed is rejected in commandment number 10. The two, idolatry and greed, are equated because both of them reduce livable reality to commodity. Idolatry is the worship overvaluing, again in parentheses to emphasize worship, overvaluing things, especially things cast in gold and silver. Remember the Jeremiah, I think was that in this study or is it something else I might know? Anyway, it gets into that. Jeremiah 10. A tree from the forest is cut down, and the work of an axe in the hands of the artisan. People deck it with silver and gold and fasten it with hammers and nails that can't be moved. The idols are like scarecrows in a cucumber field. That's an interesting reference there. And they cannot speak. They have to be carried. They cannot walk. Do not be afraid of them, for they cannot do evil, nor is it in them to do good. Coveting, at the other end of the Decalogue, consists in the pursuit of commodity at the expense of the neighbor. Sabbath is a big no to both. It is no to worship of commodity. It is no to the pursuit of commodity. But it's more than that. Sabbath is a regular, disciplined, visible, concrete yes to the neighborly reality of commodity beloved by God. We used to sing the hymn, "Take Time to Be Holy." Thought we still did, but anyway. But perhaps we were really singing, "Take time to be human." Or finally, take time. Sabbath is taking time, time to be holy, and time to be human. Psalm 73, he says, is my final text. There's a report of a journey from the world of commodity to the world of communion. In verses 2 through 16, the psalmist ruminates over the seduction of the wicked, and the wicked are prosperous, not in trouble, proud, well-fed, well-entertained, cynical and socially indifferent, treated like celebrities, defiant before and dismissive of God, and rich and at ease. Not bad, so says the psalmist. He is much attracted to such a life and thinks to enlist in it until he reflects on verse 15, until he goes to the sanctuary, until he comes to know that such a way in the world has no staying power, until he discerns himself was simply wrong. And then the psalmist utters the big nevertheless, that in Hebrews is only a conjunction with an emphatic pronoun, verse 23. Now everything is changed and differently perceived. Now the psalmist takes a different question. Whom have I in heaven but you? Answer, no one. I have no other. The parallel line is not a question but a verdict on settled reality. And there's nothing on earth that I desire other than you. Verse 25. The psalmist recognizes the question of desire. The psalmist comes to an acute awareness of the true desire of his life. He discovers in that moment that the life described in verse 2 through 16 consists of phony desires generated by culture. Now he knows better and wants only to be near to God. It occurs to me that Sabbath is a school for our desires, an expose and critique of the false desires that focus on idolatry and greed that have immense power over us. When we do not pause for Sabbath, these false desires take power over us. But Sabbath is a chance for self-embrace of our true identity. I finish with a pause at verse 23. Nevertheless, I am continually with you. You hold my right hand. Then his sort of closing here is, I recently heard a Lutheran pastor describe a woman who had walked 700 miles as a refugee to escape a violent war and finally able to cross a national boundary out of that war zone. She walked all the way and brought with her an 8-year-old girl who walked beside her for 700 miles. The child held her hand tightly. When they reached the safety, the girl loosened her grip. The woman looked at her hand. It was raw and bloody with open wounds because the little girl had held so tightly to her fearfulness. It was like that in verse 23. Nevertheless, I am continually with you. You hold my right hand. This is no casual hand holding. This is a life or death grip that does not let go. No Sabbath existence examines getting through it on our own, surrounded by commodities and accumulate, and before which we bow down. But a commodity cannot hold one's hand. Only late does the psalmist come to know otherwise. Only late may we also come to know. May we come to know, but likely not without Sabbath or rest, rooted in God's own restfulness and extended to our neighbors who must also rest. We, with our hurts, our fears, our exhaustion, are left restless until then. I didn't quite save the time for this one. Run through it quick. His closing, he says as a prayer, but it's almost just a look up and listen sort of a prayer. Our master rabbi told a tale of building bigger barns to store more grain and more stuff because the man did not know enough. Yet, before he told the tale, he said simply, be on guard against all covetousness. Luke 12:14. And we translate greed. When Jesus said that, he appealed back to Moses at Sinai. Via Moses at Sinai, we received 10 lordly words. The second word is about the worship of things, no graven images. The 10th is do not covet. Don't be greedy, don't be seeking to acquire, don't accumulate, don't be hungry, thirst no more. The Lord of the Sinai has set limits. Do not covet your neighbor's house, wife, and in 3 times, do not covet, and then 3 times says neighbor, neighbor, neighbor. We live, each of us and all of us, in an economy of coveting. The tax and mortgage laws are designed to let the powerful accumulate more. The ads are designed to make us desire what we do not need. The out-of-control military is designed to protect unsustainability, the advantage of things in the world. The ecological threat is a result of craving that violate the limit of sustainable creation. The tax laws, the TV ads, the strong military, the run of creation, all serve to impinge harmfully upon the neighborhood. The tax, the mortgage laws prey upon vulnerable neighbors. The ads seduce us to value things as substitutes for relationships. The military outlay turns neighbor into enemy. The exploitation of the earth refuses to reckon with rabbits and radishes as neighbors. But we have known better since Sinai. We know when we do Sabbath pause that we can live well without the updated computer or phone, without another new car, without elective cosmetic surgery, without remedial drugs. We cannot, on and on and on. We cannot have more deep desire to live without neighbors. We confess our anxiety about scarcity, about yet having enough or being left behind. We confess when we do Sabbath pause that we do not treasure neighbor enough. The one close at hand, the one far away, the one who shows mercy, the one who needs mercy. We pledge in your presence, greater resolve for Sabbath, that we may submit our restless anxiety to your alternative future, that we may refocus our lives in your gracious will, that we may trade coveted things for treasured neighbors, that we may come to our true selves, liberated from the tyranny of more. At sundown on Sabbath, we will gladly and loudly declare, free at last. Amen. It's been a powerful series, hasn't it?
And you know what I find fascinating? The issue of the Sabbath has been around for ages, and even now, when you ride down the street, what are the signs you see referring to Sunday?
We can sell beer now.
Yeah,
Yes.
beer now sold on Sunday. So the issue of the Sabbath or Sunday is present today.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Robert.